Welcome to the Structures and Properties of Matter workshop for the Summit Platform content assessment on this topic. Even if you're not a Summit Platform student, you can still take advantage of this video because the basics of matter and how it works is the same in any science course you take. The first objective we're going to be addressing is this idea that there are different classifications for matter and that atoms and molecules make up all the things around us in the universe. And that's what we're going to spend our first of this 3-video part series on. I want to start by defining the idea of element. An element is just a specific type of atom. There are multiple types of elements that have been discovered, over 116, I think, around this time this video was recorded. Every time we discover and stabilize a new one, somebody gets to name it. And they go in the periodic table of elements, organized in a way that helps us understand their functions and their specific properties. Each element is unique in its own way, looks different, behaves different. They can be grouped because there are some similarities across families and across periods of the periodic table, but each is unique. And that is what makes an element important, because each element has is a specific type of chemical, because it's based on a specific type of building block or atom. I think of them as the letters with which the universe spells everything that it actually builds. So if the universe is like a beautiful novel, the elements are its letters. The examples that you may have been familiar with are things like gold, zinc, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, and so many others that you find in the periodic table of elements. But remember, it's just another word for a type of atom. We'll talk more about what atoms are in a second here. That's different from the idea of a compound. A compound is when you put two or more of these types of atoms together chemically to create a new substance with its own unique characteristics. That's actually very important for the content assessment. This idea that when two elements are combined to form a new type of substance, they actually make a new set of chemical characteristics that reacts and behaves its own particular way. An example of that would be water, which is H2O. That means two hydrogens and one oxygen are put together to make it. Carbon dioxide, which is a type of gas you find in the atmosphere that when you breathe out, that's one carbon and two oxygen atoms put together. Sugar, one of the most important molecules for life. It has carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen inside. You got salt, the most common type of salt that you find in your table, the one that makes the sea salty, sodium chloride. All of these are examples of compounds, and what they all have in common is that it takes more than one type of atom to build them. So if elements are the letters with which the universe writes things, compounds are the words. So either compounds or elements can be found in one place by themselves when we consider a pure substance. Pure substance is a classification that just means you only have one type of chemical in the place. So if you have a container full of water and there's only water inside, distilled water, nothing dissolved inside, that would be considered a pure substance. If you have a bar of gold that's absolutely pure, that's an element of a pure substance because it's just gold. An oxygen tank full of oxygen inside, that gas inside, would be considered a pure substance because it's just oxygen. If you do the same on a carbon dioxide fire extinguisher, that's just carbon dioxide. I think they pretty much have other things inside. But if you could have a container just full of carbon dioxide, that would be considered a pure substance. So they can be elements or they can be compounds. The difference is, or what they have in common actually, is that they have only one type of substance in one place. You call that a pure substance. That's different from the idea of a mixture. A mixture is when you have more than one type of chemical in the same place without necessarily chemically combining them to form a new chemical entity. It doesn't have its own set of chemical characteristics, right? It has actually different parts which are kind of in the same space, but still retaining the unique properties on their own. So if you look at salt water that makes the ocean, there's a salt there and there's the water there, each doing its own chemical thing, but they're in the same space. The atmosphere is full of gases. You have sand, you have soil, blood, a scuba tank. All of these things are examples of things that have a mixture of substances inside. Now, this could be like if you look at the soil or sand, multiple different kinds of minerals and particles all combined together in a way that you can tell there's different things in there if you look up close enough. Or it could be something like salt water, where you can't really tell that there's two things in there unless you taste it or try to evaporate it or boil it or realize that it's not just pure water. Same thing with the air. It's kind of hard to tell that there's different gases in it until you pay attention to it. But sometimes it's pretty obvious it's a mixture. When you put oil and water together and you see that they don't really mix very well, and those are called heterogeneous mixtures because you can tell there's two different things mixed together. But it doesn't have to be that way. They can be so well mixed that you cannot tell there's more than one thing inside. You can't tell by the color, certainly, because just because it's transparent, it doesn't mean it's pure. Water looks transparent whether it has salt in it or not. If it has a little bit of salt, you can't tell it apart just by looking at it. You can't tell it by the temperature of it, because just because it's 50 degrees, that doesn't mean it's water. It could be water, it could be with salt inside. But you can't tell if you try to boil it, because each chemical has a specific boiling point. We'll talk more about that on the third video of this series. So a mixture, though, could be just elements put together. So if you think about the scuba dive tank that I talked about earlier, it usually has nitrogen gas and oxygen gas inside. So two elements combined to create something similar to the atmosphere that you would breathe when you are not going underwater, right? You could also have a mixture of compounds, like if you look at sand, or if you look at salt water. Salt water has the salt, which is a compound, and the water, which is a compound, all mixed together to form its own mixture. It could also be a mixture of compounds and elements. Like, for example, if you look at the gas of the atmosphere, you have nitrogen gas and oxygen gas, like I just mentioned, but you also have other things which are compounds, like carbon dioxide and methane gas and trace amounts of water vapor and things like that. So all of these things are examples of mixtures. The next thing I want to talk about is this idea of an atom. Now remember, each element is a different type of atom. But what an atom is the smallest unit of that element that you can have, the smallest building block, before it stops acting like that element. If you break it down any further than an atom, because atoms can be broken down further, they're made of tiny little parts inside, but it would no longer be acting like that atom if you split it into its component parts. It wouldn't be acting like its own element. Elements can be, by the way, made up of more than one element. You can find them together, like in a bar of gold, hundreds of atoms, billions of atoms of gold put together. Or oxygen gas, which is usually two oxygen atoms combined together, and that's how you find them in a molecule format. We'll talk about that in a second. But an atom is the smallest piece of that you can break it down until the element can still behave like its element. The periodic table of elements is full of examples of these atoms. And there's a lot of representations that have been done throughout history to represent what it actually looked like. And we keep evolving our understanding of how the basics of the atom. But one thing we know for sure is that they too are made of smaller parts. But if you broke it down, it would no longer act like the element that it is. Then you have this idea of molecule. A molecule is also a smallest chemical unit, but it's for a substance that it is contained of two or more atoms combined. Not to be confused with compounds, which are two or more types of atoms. A molecule is a characterization for any type of atomic combination when you have two or more atoms combined. Now, normally that ends up being a compound, like carbon monoxide, which is carbon and oxygen together, or carbon dioxide, one carbon and two oxygens, or methane gas with a carbon and four hydrogens, or this molecule that you see here of caffeine, which has carbon and nitrogen, oxygen, and methane groups all combined to form this molecule. Now, a molecule, though, is the smallest piece you can have before that substance stops acting like that substance. So if you break it down, if you separate the carbon and the oxygen in the carbon monoxide, it won't act like carbon dioxide anymore. Now, while it's true that a lot of them are compounds, you can have what is called an elemental molecule, which is one where you have two of the same type of atom combined together to form a molecule, like oxygen gas. You see here in the top left of the picture is just two oxygens put together. And so it's technically still elemental, but it's a molecule because it's two or more atoms put together. So I think it's good time to review everything we just did and talk about the differences between these kinds of key terms. So in here you have element, compound, pure substance, mixtures, atoms, and molecules. So let's go through all of them one more time. Remember, elements is one chemical. It is always, by definition, therefore, going to be a pure substance. But a pure substance can also be a compound, which is when you have two or more types of elements chemically combined together. Now, if you have a combination of different types of elements or different types of compounds, or elements and compounds put together in the same place but not chemically combined, each part is still chemically isolated from the other. They're just in the same physical space. Now you've made a mixture, because a pure substance would require only one type of physical thing in that space, while a mixture will have two or more types of substances in the same physical space, but not chemically combined. The moment you start chemically combining, you're making compounds. But how is a compound different from a molecule? Well, a molecule is also when you have two or more atoms together. But a compound is going to be different in the sense that it has two or more types of atoms combined together, where a molecule is just two or more atoms, period. And it could be a compound, or it could be elemental in the sense that you have two or more atoms of the same element put together. An atom is just another name for the smallest unit of chemistry that you can have before you stop acting like a particular type of element. If you break it down any further, it would no longer be an element, which is the same thing a molecule is for substances made up of more than one atom. If you break down molecules further, it will break down into its atoms. It will no longer be able to actually act like a substance that it is. So do remember that. Molecules are made up of atoms, but not necessarily atoms of different types. If the atoms are of different types, that molecule can also represent the idea of a compound that has more than one type of atom in there. And so that is the overview of these different classifications of matter, which you will have to deal with on the exam. The other thing I want to talk about to wrap up this video is that you need to be able to recognize that when there are different atoms in one place, you are looking at a molecule. And in fact, you can even count the number of atoms. Like in this example, you have a formula for sugar, one of the most important molecules in life. And it already tells you with this little subscript here, the number of atoms of each type that you find in the molecule. So you have 6 carbons, you have a hydrogen times 12, and 6 oxygens as well. Now in this representation of a molecule, we actually have the little structure representation for it, and we can count the atoms as well. All the black ones are carbons, then you have the hydrogen ones, which are the white ones, and then the blue ones are nitrogen, and the red ones are representing as oxygen over here. And of course, you can change those colors for the elements, but in this picture, that's how they represented it, and you can count them up and figure out the total number of elements of each type. There are questions like that in the test, but the more important question is to recognize that when you have these individual circles representing the atoms all attached to each other with bonds, you're talking about a molecule, right? And if the molecule happens to have more than one type of atom, that's also representing a compound. Now, speaking of compounds and elements, what makes an atom different from another? What is it that makes one element unique? Well, the periodic table is made of multiple ones of these, and the difference between each one is that the parts that make it up could be different, specifically with the number of positive charges found inside of the nucleus of the atom. So the most basic definition of how the structure of an atom looks like is you have these negative electron particles orbiting around the outside, chaotically everywhere and nowhere at the same time around the nucleus, made up of a combination of neutral particles called neutrons and positive particles called protons. Now, at different times, it is possible for atoms to lose or gain electrons and become charged in the process. And it's possible for them to have more or less neutrons and become less or more stable, which is what leads to radioactivity. But what's different about each element is the number of protons. Each element has a unique number of protons. So if you look at hydrogen, for example, it has 1 proton. And it could gain an electron, it could gain a neutron, and still be called a hydrogen. But at the moment you go to 2 protons, now you made helium. If you went to 3, you would have lithium, 4 beryllium, and then boron and carbon and nitrogen and oxygen and so forth throughout the periodic table. As you add more protons, you make more different elements. So the elements are different in size also, because of the number of protons that they have inside their nucleus. But it's really not the mass or the size that we look at. We look at the number of positive particles. Now, there is another name for that. It's called the atomic number, or the number of positive particles. Do not be confused with atomic mass or mass number or atomic size. All of those things are helpful to talk about the different elements, but elements could tie in those things because at different times they could have different amounts of electrons and neutrons, but they could not have different protons and still be called the same atom type. So it's the number of protons, which is also called the atomic number, that tells the difference between the atoms of the different elements in the periodic table. Last topic of objective 1 is this idea of a chemical bond. Now, we talked about how molecules are made up when you actually have more than one atom combined. And if you have different types of atoms, you call them as a compound. How do you make those things? Well, remember those electrons I just mentioned that orbit around the outside of the nucleus of the atoms? Atoms can actually share those electrons or transfer between one atom and the other. And in doing so, create attractions between the atoms to form them bonds, chemical bonds. So chemical bonds are electromagnetic attractions between atoms because of the sharing or transferring of electrons. Now, different kinds of bonds. The sharing ones are called covalent. The transfer ones are called ionic. You have metallic bonds where the atoms are just all kind of sharing electrons in kind of like a mesh of electrons. But you don't really need to know that at this level. All you need to know is that bonds are connections between atoms when they share or transfer electrons between them. And so that is it for the first objective of this lecture series. On the next one, we're going to focus on objective 2, which is the chemical and physical properties of matter and how you can use them to identify substances. I'll see you guys then.